This is one of the hardest videos I've ever had to record. I'm going to do it in one take, so please bear with me. I also don't have a script because I never have a script for these. These are class recaps for my students who weren't here and all of the lovely people who want to hear about what I do in class. And at the end of every course, I do stars and wishes with my students who have a kind of structure of the course where the first third is like the lore dump, the things that I think they need to know. Then it's more open world where I have options for pathways we can follow, and students get to help pick between those. And at the end, they're doing self-directed work in many cases towards their unessay projects. So we are now firmly in that middle space. And by the end, students have the knowledge base to be able to say, Dr. Friedman, next time you teach this, you should have more of this. You should swap this. This worked really well. This is a topic that you addressed and we want to go in more depth. We think you should go in more depth. And the number one thing that students said to me last fall was, you need to tell us more about GamerGate. And that is incredibly hard, and why at the time that I'm recording this, I am intending to put the video behind my extra credit wall for a hot second. I'm squirming in my seat. And will ultimately probably release it to all of my Patreon subscribers, but not beyond that for the foreseeable. If I'm going to talk about this in public, I want to do so, I think, in a more polished way than me talking about what I did in class. So, when I revised, and this course is heavily revised from last time, and it really is responsive to students' requests, I knew that this was something I needed to do. So this is, as you'll see in the text notes for this video, there is a lot of supplementary material, because what I didn't want to do was have the chilling effect of GamerGate be the final thing that we say about especially the primary targets of GamerGate, which began with an attack on Zoe Quinn, the creator of Depression Quest, moved on to Anita Sarkeesian, the creator of Feminist Frequency, a YouTube channel and larger initiative. The third target was Lee Alexander, a game journalist at the time who was all but driven out of that particular aspect of public presence, and now works as a game narrative designer, among other hats that she wears. And on and on and on. Talented women with different visions about what it meant to actually improve the conditions of the game industry, using very different tactics, who didn't necessarily think of themselves as poster children for a fight, nevertheless became them. And these are my direct contemporaries. Lee Alexander is a month younger than I am, and I never forget that. And I wanted to honor the fact that many of them don't want GamerGate to define their existence. It has defined enough of their working lives to date. And so, to you and to them, to my students, I wanted to make this the first day that we talk about game journalism, and we talk about it from two different ways of thinking about it. One is the enormous richness and fecundity of writing about games that has existed for longer than they've been alive, that we are in constant danger of forgetting. So the first thing that I had students read is the same thing I had them read last year, which is Kieron Gillen's The New Game Journalism, Gita Jackson's The New Game Journalism, which is a commentary on the great forgetting that has happened, so much so that a group of really talented writers and academics Columbused their way into writing about games and used for their book title the same title that had been used almost a decade earlier. Right? So the erasure of women and other people who are writing about games, the entire field has both violent and hostile faces, but also these kinds of much more subtle faces. And then I have an ambivalent feeling about Rascal's The New Tabletop Journalism, but I included it, and I'm happy to talk about my ambivalence. But it is another landmark in this kind of tradition of polemics about and statements and manifestos about what game journalism can be. In addition, there is an enormous Google Doc that I will link as I linked to my students of a anthology by topic of great and interesting and important and foundational writing about games that has occurred in the public sphere on conceivably every topic under the sun. Because what I wanted to do, my students are all female this semester, and one of the things and my students thus immediately understood the idea of male hostility. That was not foreign to them. What was foreign to them was the idea that a couple of questions, and I posted about this on Blue Sky, and I'm recording this in one take, so please forgive me if I get emotional, because I got emotional then. I managed to hold it together in class. But the first question my students had was a very factual one, that in many historical discussions, which for them, this is history, they were children, that this is still impacting all of our lives, and doing so in not just in games, right? This was never about ethics in game journalism. And now we know in recent days and weeks that it was central to, we already knew that, but now we have even more evidence than before that this was the opening salvo of a much larger attack on marginalized folks and their ability to both make culture and talk about culture. But my students think of this as a historical event that they've never heard about and they're curious about. So they said, Dr. Friedman, when did GamerGate end? And I had to tell them that it didn't. I had to tell them that it's the reason why I have a Patreon, to put a subscriber wall on some of my material that I teach. Because I came into the field, I was an assistant professor watching GamerGate play out, but also a very similar coordinated attacks on my colleagues like the Medievalists of Color and Dorothy Kim, who I learned how to keep myself safe to an extent and to make the kind of hard decisions about how public to be in different kinds of ways and when it was worth it. Because my friend Dorothy Kim, or I would like to call her my friend, that's maybe parasocial, we have met, but someone who people I admire a great deal, like Dorothy Kim, to this day operate under security protocols. As I told my students, Charlie Kirk was killed speaking at the same institution that Anita Sarkeesian refused to speak at because of a credible threat against her life. And people mocked her for being cautious, for taking that death threat seriously. And that many of the victims of GamerGate were also mocked for being unreasonable, for taking these things too seriously. It's just online, after all. And so, no, it didn't stop, because it didn't start with GamerGate. It started with attacks on minoritized folks of all kinds, especially Black women, long before that. And it became a playbook that worked. And then my students then asked the question, why didn't anybody stop this? Why didn't anybody realize that these were unreasonable attacks? Why did it keep going even then? And I had to explain to them that that's how this works. There's the violent part of these kinds of playbooks, but then those are so comedically ridiculous in many ways, because 4chan, among other things, that another group might think of it as overblown. And if we just ignore it, maybe it'll go away. And sometimes that is a winning strategy for having something blow over and not have the so-called Streisand effect. But at a certain point, no, you have to intervene. But who do you intervene to? because there were people who took it seriously. And then if they spoke out, they in turn became the next targets of this diffuse, leaderless, and yet coordinated harassment campaign. Because Sarah Zed has talked about this. Any number of people have talked about the ways in which this kind of violence perpetuates. That some of it is completely off base, and some of it is completely disconnected from reality, and some of it ties just enough onto the truth that reasonable people then take up that part of it. Because, yeah, we should talk about ethics in game journalism and ethics in journalism more generally, especially in a time where, to cover a scene, a niche, means that people know each other. But it had nothing to do with what Zoe Quinn was doing. And it had nothing to do with Anita Sarkeesian, and nothing to do with Lee Alexander, or any of the other women who were the initial targets of GamerGate. That was bullshit. And it should have been treated as bullshit. Because it was a false initial claim. But because it is reasonable to have that particular conversation, everything else comes underneath it. In the same way, in a weird way, that using the term AI means everything from completely legitimate uses of machine learning to do very specific tasks with curated data, thus becomes the way in which an enormous amount of destructive to human dignity, to our environment, to our economy, to labor, technologies get to come in the same umbrella. I meant to record this yesterday, but I had an interview with a student who was working on a journalism project. And they asked me about how things are connected in my brain. And for me, so much of this is about the dignity of human making. So much of my career has been about people and how they receive works of art in community or by themselves, and across the span of time, how works of art actually transform once they're loosed from the hands of the people who made them. How some things are made as intimate gifts for one person or made just for someone all by themselves, but are transformed. And humans make them. And technology has changed the ways in which these things are disseminated, even sometimes created. And that's important too, because those technologies are also made by people. They're powered by people. And that anytime we give the idea that technology has had sentience, what it has become is, what it really is what the 18th century knew quite well, the mechanical Turk. Which is to say, the robot that played chess, but really there were people inside. Because it was always a trick. And that's not to denigrate the fact that technology indeed shapes us, but people shape the technology, and we have the political will to say otherwise. It is the norms of people. Why doesn't GamerGate stop? Because my students have belief and faith, a touching belief, in the idea that there are institutions that will step in and intervene. And it's hard to disabuse them of that notion. I'm realizing only now that as I record this that two of my students are watching this to get a recap of class. And this is, I hate to break it to you guys, this is indeed kind of what happened in class. And then we kind of went off into other tangents of thinking about the ways in which culture, what we're talking about is what cultural criticism and cultural studies does, right? And English is one discipline of many that have practitioners of cultural studies in all kinds of ways. And cultural studies does what we did the other day with Meg A. Baker, reading not just texts, but the landscape as text, architecture as text, games as text, the ways in which we do things. I cited Tressie McMillan Cottom's ongoing work trying to understand the culture of what blondness means in our society and in other Western societies, and indeed beyond that. because it's not just about hair color. It comes with all of this other stuff that humans have brought and disseminated through art and culture and through how they interact with one another and how systems are built that are predicated on the assumptions that systems both inform culture and are shaped by culture, and thus understanding culture is the important way to understand the systems that control our lives. Because we are not individuals. We are collectives, communities, interconnected networks. It's always about people in the end. I hope that gave you a sense of the kinds of places that we went in a 75-minute class, trying to understand the impossible to understand, which is a historic event that had an acute period but long-ranging ramifications. Some of you who are watching this, not my students, will understand that one of the examples that I gave to my students was 9/11. That 9/11 was an acute crisis that changed the New York landscape in all kinds of ways, some of which have been rebuilt or transformed. But that the systems that we live and work under, especially say when we go to the airport, but also beyond, were shaped in the aftermath of 9/11. We are still in the 9/11 period in terms of institutions that were made using 9/11 as a rationale. We can like them, we can loathe them, we can feel ambivalent or some kind of way about them. We can have complicated understandings of all of those ramifications. Nuance is, after all, my business. But we can't deny that they didn't always exist. And they didn't always have to exist. And they didn't exist in this way. And so anything made by humans can be transformed by them as well. So that's what we did on Monday in class as we begin our period of thinking about, we've documented our play, we've analyzed play texts and thought about them, we've played to find out all kinds of things, we've talked to designers, and now we're going to talk to folks who think public facing, how to communicate what games are and how games are played and all of those kinds